A program to celebrate the anniversary of Mayor Baba's visit to Mayor Mount, which was on August 2nd, 1956. The only time he actually got here. He was on his way here, of course, in 1952 to spend 10 days when the collision happened near Prague, Oklahoma. But he did come in 1956 and fulfilled that promise. And he sat alone under the tree that is called Baba's tree. He spent most of the day over sitting in what was then the guest house. The only artifact left from that is that fireplace and chimney out there. Although we do want to build a structure around that so that people can sit there again. That connotes the place where Baba sat, and people can feel like they're in that space that he was in at that time. So those are two of the key touch points on the property if you haven't spent much time here. And today we are celebrating that anniversary with some very special guests, part of Baba's family, his niece, Shireen Bonner, and her husband, Jay. Longtime Baba people, born into, what, third generation even, Baba family. So wonderful stories that she can bring us. She met Baba and spent time with him 3 different times, but really grew up in the atmosphere of Baba and of his family in very intimate ways. And that really comes through when she shares her background and stories. And Jay equally has wonderful stories about what it's like. And I think we're all very curious to know what's it like to marry into Baba's family. And I'm sure that's also very special. And Jay's a very accomplished artist who has worked on design elements for many years, I guess, with some of the holiest places in Saudi Arabia, in the holy cities there. So he also has an amazing background as an artist in addition to being part of Baba's family. So without further ado, I want to introduce Shireen Bonner for this morning's session.
Thank you very much, Sam, for that nice introduction. And I want to say, really a big thank you to all of you, to Mayor Mount for inviting us. We've never visited here before. My mum, who some of you know, Shireen Irani, did come here in the early 90s, and it's not entirely, we don't know if she met Agnes, she might have done. But we've heard so much about Mayor Mount, and we've wanted to visit for a really long time. And thank you very much for having us. And Sam and Margaret especially for your very gracious welcome and picking us up and feeding us and driving us, and we've been made to feel very, very welcome, and it's really wonderful to be here. So thank you so much for inviting us to speak. I'm pretty an informal speaker, so I hope that's okay. These are the notes that I wrote when I was 16 and gave my first talk about Baba in Little Beach, so I probably should, type them up. I hope I won't have to refer to them too much, but Jay's going to help me along, and we'll help each other, and I'll probably leave some things out. And please ask questions at the end. That's something that I always enjoy, and if you would like, and also it can kind of trigger some memories. But I thought I'd just give some context as to, I know some of you and many are new friends. So as Sam said, I'm Baba's niece, and many of you might know my brother, Dara Irani. And Dara and I share the same dad, but we don't have the same mum. And you probably know my cousins, Saurabh and Rustam. And then in terms of the Mandali and people in India, Mani Irani was my aunt, my paternal aunt, to whom I was extremely close. And Gohar and Katie, who some of you might have met, were my mum's cousins. So the Irani clan's a very tight clan, and as I've said to a few people already, if I ever in the world meet an Irani, I'm related. There is no, it's happened, believe me. It's like I just had to go back a few times. So, and for those of you, you know, you probably all know of the Parsis, and then the Iranis were the more recent immigrants to India from Iran, and tended to be very close-knit. Didn't intermarry with the Indians, of course adopted many of the Indian customs and cultures, but didn't intermarry. And I probably am wrong about this, and I may be wrong about a lot of things. Please don't email me, just go to Lord Mayor and check. But, I'm fairly certain that within our family, in Baba's family, my brother's marriage to Amrit was the first time somebody in our extended family had married a non-Irani. Amrit's Indian, Hindu, and then I married Jay. So I just wanted to give the context of who we are. My father was Adi S. Irani, and he was known as Adi Junior because there was Adi K, who was Adi Senior. Adi K. Irani was Baba's secretary. He was his secretary, right? Adi K. Yeah. So my dad had the sort of nickname Adi Junior. Yes, did you want me to do something?
No, I'm helping somebody get it.
Oh, sorry, okay. So, and it's only really in fairly recent years that I've even thought about, not questioned, not that I've sort of questioned it so much, but I've thought about why or how it was that our side of the family, as it were, that we were the only ones to have lived in the West. So, again, for the full lineage of Mayor Baba's siblings, please consult whatever reliable source you have. But Adi my father was Baba's youngest brother, and he was younger than him, but younger than Baba by about 19 years. And Adi married my mother, Franey, who was Goher and Katie's cousin. And they were the only ones who left India. Ostensibly they left Baba. So, you know, I was consequently born and raised in the West, which I was sort of the first one to be born in the West. My brother, Dara, was 13 when he came to England, and I'll get to that story in a little bit. So I've just sort of accepted it, but over the years my mum has spoken and told her story, and she has some amazing stories. But I thought I'd just explain how it was that Adi and Franey ended up in England, and that, you know, they didn't stay in India with Baba, and I was born in the West and raised there, and my brother Dara from the age of 13. So Adi was married before to Dara's mother, as I mentioned, and very tragically she died in childbirth, giving birth to Dara. So many years later, my parents married, and my mum, you know, was really into England and the idea of the British. I mean, she wasn't in favour of the British Empire per se, but she thought the Brits were great, and England, you know, cleaned up India, and they shot the rabid dogs, and it was all very nice, and the British schools. So she had a fascination for England. My father really liked the English, and he was particularly close you know, in terms of Baba's disciples in the West. He struck up lifelong friendships with Donkin, Delia Dillian, Margaret Cross, and Kitty Davey. So, and I'm assuming that most of you know who these people are. Very early disciples of Baba's. And my dad met most of these people when he was only 18. So he loved the British, he loved the English sort of sensibility. My father was, what were you saying the other day? My father was, you know, broadly speaking, you could say the intellect of the intellectual one of the brothers. He was very well read, very erudite. I'm not sure if this is entirely true, but I always heard that he actually had been accepted to Cambridge in England, but there was no way he could go. So he liked to read. He was, you know, he loved his English professors at school. So he had that really strong connection to the English sort of psyche or personality in that way, but he was definitely opposed to the idea of the British Empire. And he had no interest in moving to England until my mum basically made him do it. So they married, and they went on honeymoon to England, I think in 1952, and that's a story in and of itself. And anyway, the time came that they really wanted to, or my mum really wanted to leave India and get out. She wanted to get away from a very close-knit, sort of gossipy Ahmednagar. And she wanted to move to England. So Baba was initially reluctant to agree to that. America came up and England. And Baba said, not America. I mean, it was pretty like, no, not America, England. So, contacts were made, and because of my parents' or my dad's very close friendship and connection to Delia de Leon, who lived in England. So you probably know that Margaret and Kitty ended up at the Meher Baba Centre in Myrtle Beach. Delia stayed in England, and that's what Baba had told her to do. Do any of you know Delia? Did any of you meet her?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of her?
Yes.
Yeah. So she was remarkable, a very close family friend of ours. So through her connection mainly, my parents, went to England. And they moved to England, I think in 1956. And my poor father just hated it. He hated the weather, he hated everything about it, just miserable. And, my mum was just excited, I'm in England now. So, I suppose it must have been early in 56. A big change for my parents was that, they had had a life of, in India in those days, there would be someone to cook for you and all of that. So they're in England, it's a foreign country, it's cold. Initially when they were looking for housing, they were sort of looking in the wrong part of London and people were not friendly. But they had the Baba contacts, they had Delia, they had Fred Marks, if any of you know who he was, and Will and Mary Beckett, very close, and Aminta de Leon. And if anybody, wants to ask me who I'm talking about, please just interrupt. But Will and Mary Beckett were very early disciples of Baba's. He referred to them as his archangels. And I think they died shortly after I was born. So my parents moved in 56. My dad wasn't happy, was just hoping, he was sort of counting down the days for this to all go completely wrong so they could just get back to India. And my mum, they realised that she had to find a job. And she hadn't been trained to do anything. They really needed money. My father very quickly set up a little antiques business, which he continued for much of his life. But they needed more than that. So, my mum had to find a job. So she didn't know what to do. So she trained as a beautician and got her certification. But she just couldn't find work. And she was very, very frustrated because her frustration was that if she didn't find a job, they probably would have to leave. Meanwhile, my dad's smile was great. It's just going to happen. So, and again, I hope I've got this timing, the chronology of it correct. So, at some point in 1956, Baba and some of the men Mandali went to England, and they stayed some of the time at the Rubens Hotel in London. So they called my parents, amongst many other people, Baba called them to see him. So he asked, my mum went in and he said, you look a little downcast, Franny, what's the matter? And she said, well, I can't find work and I'm worried I'm going to have to leave England and go back to India. And, she had received this training. So in that interview, and again, there's a much more sort of fulsome story of how my mum relates it, Baba basically said to her, look, you have to find a job by X amount of time, and if you don't, you have to go back to India. So my mum, of course accepted that, but she was very downcast. And then in the midst of that conversation, he said to her, do you want a baby? And she said, I do, but only if you want me to, Baba. And I think it had been a while, they had wanted a baby. For a while it hadn't happened. So she said, if you want that for me, Baba, I do. And he said, don't worry, it'll all work out and you'll have a girl. So she was happy with that, but not happy with the job side of things. So again, she told my dad, and he was sort of like, good, we're leaving soon. So she had a last opportunity to go for an interview to get a job as a beautician at a sort of salon, you know. And DeLeon's sister, Minta, who was a very glamorous woman and who was a fascinating person, and I highly recommend Delia's book, The Ocean of Love. It's an incredibly beautiful book, and she writes about Minta a lot. Delia's, so Minta, actually my parents stayed with Minta for a while, and it didn't go well. That wasn't easy for them, but she gave my mum some good advice. She said, look, Freddie, you know, you always go to these interviews dressed in a sari. This was in '56. You know, you have beautiful long hair, but why don't you just try and be a little more modern, a bit more Western? So she said, shed the sari, wear a dress, and she said, you know, get your hair cut. And that was a hard thing for my mum. So she did it though. She went to a fairly well-known hairdresser who chopped off her hair, and he said, oh, if we had just an inch longer, I could have sold this hair, or something, you know, some story she tells. So she completely sort of redid herself. And she went to the interview, and she was the last in the queue of people who were waiting to go in, women who were waiting to go in. And she was looking at all these people, and she thought, well, there's just no way I'm going to get this job, you know. And anyway, she did go in, and the man who interviewed her was really very nice, and he said, well, you know, Mrs. Irani, do you really want to do this work? I mean, your hands are so delicate, because I think it was sort of a massage. And she said, I really do need this job. And she talked a little bit more, and she fully expecting that she wouldn't get the job. And then he just said to her, when can you start? So she got the job just in the nick of time, which meant that according to what Barbara had said, they could stay on. So that was it for my poor father. I mean, he was so miserable, but yeah, okay, that's done. And then she barely started, and then she found out she was pregnant. So she didn't know how to tell her employers. She felt, you know, she'd perhaps been a bit disingenuous, but it wasn't intentional. So then she went back to wearing saris, so nobody knew she was pregnant. And then right at the end, you know, she told them, and it all worked out very happily. So that was the whole kind of catalyzing, you know, sequence of events that meant that my parents lived in England, in London, and then I was born a year later. So my dad was a little bit a fish out of water, only in the sense that he was an Eastern man in this freezing cold country, and he just detested the weather. But of course, with the Barber community, and my parents were very, you know, friendly, sort of sociable people, so they made lots of friends, and you know, we ended up, well, we lived in the most beautiful part of London, and some of you have been to our house in London. So Barbara named it Mermansell, and it was in a place called Barnes, London. It was right on the edge of London, very, very gorgeous. And with the house, just parenthetically, I've often thought I want to actually get out some kind of massive tape measure. So our house was on a cul-de-sac, just a lovely neighbourhood. And I really think our house was literally in the middle. One side there was a church, and the other side there was the vicarage. We were like in Church of England territory. And we were right there in the middle. And the minute, you know, this was a beautiful Victorian house, and the minute my parents moved in, my dad ripped out the windows, and or not the minute, but not long after, and then kind of created an arch. He was quite a handyman. He sort of put in an arched window, and there was a photo of Barbara in the window. And this pretty, you know, conservative 1950s, 60s London. It wasn't like it is then, like it is now. And we learned later that for so many years, people thought my dad was a diplomat, because we put Barbara's flag up. I mean, no one had a clue, you know, Barbara's flag up, and there's this photo, they just thought, oh yeah. So anyway, we were right there with the church, and we had this sort of involvement with the church. So that's where we were, and I was born in 1957. So after a few months, I think after 3 months, my mum naturally wanted to take me to India, to, you know, take me to meet her family, her parents. I mean, she'd left her mum, you know, it was a big thing to, can't imagine it really. And of course she wanted me to meet Barbara and Mera and Mani. So again, Mani is my aunt. and I was called Mara, my aunt, and she wanted me to meet the women monthly. So my parents and I, as a baby, went to India. I suppose it was 1958, or maybe at the end of maybe it was the end of 57. I was born in September. And my father stayed for, I'm not sure how long, and my mum and I stayed for 6 months. So my mum always tells the story that when she brought me back to England, I didn't I think I did recognise my father, but anyway, she was worried I wouldn't. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but what was so wonderful and interesting is that my father stayed on for, I'm going to call it a month and a half, and he came back because he had to work. And my mum came back with me and my brother Dara, which was not a plan. They weren't going to India to bring Dara back. That transpired, I think, during the visit, and Dara said, I want to, and I'll explain a little bit what happened with Dara in that way. Dara's mother so tragically died in childbirth. Dara's aunt is Vilu, if any of you knew Vilu and Sarosh. So Dara's maternal aunt is Vilu. And, in those days in India especially, a dad, my father, was not going to raise a son as a single father. It just wouldn't happen. So Dara was taken into Vilu's family and raised with her children, but with my dad as a constant presence, and they all lived so close together, and maybe they lived together. It's just the whole extended family. And then when my parents married in India, Dara would spend a lot of time with my parents. But when my parents moved to England, and I asked Dara about this recently, but I don't think it was had been fully thought that Dara's going to go back to England with us. But he did. So my mum, went back to England with a baby and a teenage son. He was 13. So I grew up with him, which was really wonderful for me. So my parents took me to India as a baby, and that was the first time I met Baba. So, my mum, of course, has a story about that. And Baba met innumerable babies met him and sat on his lap. But, I was very fortunate. And my Aunt Manny used to tell the story that my mum, first of all, was terribly worried that I would, Baba wore white, that I would, a baby, things would happen. And luckily nothing went awry. And my mum's a bit of an anxious person, and she thought I would fuss and maybe I wouldn't smile at Baba, but thankfully it was just the opposite. I was really gurgling. And I'm just saying this is what Manny used to say. So, at one point he was holding me and I swiveled my head to look at him, and I don't remember the exact words, but then Baba sort of said to the Mandali, you think this is the first time we've met, referring to me, which, so of course my mum loved hearing that. She was just so happy to have heard that. So that was the baby visit. And then I came home as a baby to London, did recognise my father, thankfully. And then I grew up in a very, again, this would be England in the late 50s and early 60s, and we sort of had two lives. There was the English life. I went to a very English school. I was a proper little English girl. And then there was our Baba life. But until I was 7, I didn't really know about, I just knew Baba was there. I didn't, we had photos all over our house, but my dad hadn't told me anything about him. So we had our Baba friends, Delia, so many people. Did any of you know of Tom and Dorothy Hopkinson? Perhaps did you? Yeah. Just wonderful people, much, much older than my parents. And Delia primarily. So I knew that there was something different about us. In the meantime, my parents had become good friends with the local vicar. And he used to come over and I presume asked about Baba, but again, this was England, people were very polite. They'd see, our house was like a shrine, there were photos everywhere. But no, in England, very, very few people would ask anything. But maybe the vicar did, I have no idea. But anyway, because we had these sort of ties to the Church of England, I think. So when I was 7, and because we were born into the Zoroastrian faith, all of us, and I was, so maybe there's a ceremony that occurs at the age of 7-ish for most children, and it's called the Navjote ceremony. And I suppose it would be, comparable to a Christian confirmation ceremony. So, first of all, Baba and his whole family was Zoroastrian. And you all know how Baba was about people honouring their religions if they wanted to and all that. But more to the point, my mum's father was a very, very devout Zoroastrian. And he must have been a very interesting man. So he did not believe in Baba, but he completely respected him. The reason my mum came to Baba is because her mother was a Baba follower. So this man, Din Shah, my grandfather, wasn't a Baba follower, strict Zoroastrian, went and said his prayers, 5 times a day. But, it's an appropriate word. In those days, he allowed his wife to go and see my Baba. He allowed his daughter, which I think says a lot for him, actually, for that era. And so what I did want to mention, and help me get back on track if I completely, is so my mum and her family grew up in what is now the trust quarters. Have some of you been to India, into the trust quarters? So in those, Ahmednagar. So in those days, they were known as Kushru quarters. So the Iranis, as I say, very, very tight clan. My mum grew up in what she always called the joint family system. So, I hope I've got this right. It was her father Din Shah and his wife and children, his brother Saroj, so my mum's uncle was Saroj Irani actually named my mother, his family, and then Gulmai, Adike, and Gulmai was, Baba referred to Gulmai as his spiritual mother. So, going back, my mum first met Baba at Kashri quarters because Baba would come to Kashri quarters specifically to visit Gulmai, but I'm sure Saroj as well. And my mum would see him, and then my mother's mother, Suna, would go to see Baba. And one day at an appropriate age, I guess, my mum was taken to see Baba, and from that minute she loved him. And my mum tells a lovely story. She says she always thought Baba was a magician because he'd come into the gate and he'd float. And she'd say to her mum, how is it he doesn't touch his feet to the ground? So she always has that memory. And, I like to say this because I don't know that there's anyone else, maybe there is, but my mum saw Upasani Maharaj, and do you all know who he was? Mm-hmm. So Upasani was one of the 5 perfect masters. So my mum saw him, and I'm sure my father did, and my father spent a lot of time with Babajan, who was the perfect master in Pune. So, oh gosh, I've lost my thread. Anyway, we got back to England. Is that what I'm saying? Yes, and then we were preparing for. So I turned 7, and just all these things came about. So 7 is the age for the Navjote ceremony. So because my mum's father so wanted his granddaughter, I wasn't his only grandchild, to go through that rite of passage in the Zoroastrian faith, he basically wrote to my mum and said, I hope you're going to bring Shireen to India for the Navjote. So my parents wrote to Baba because they didn't do anything. They were geographically distant, but they didn't do anything without asking Baba. There was constant communication, which in those days must have been hard. It was letters, telegrams, and phone calls. And I can remember when there'd be a knock at the door, always hoping it was the postman or the special delivery person with a telegram from Baba. There were so many telegrams from Baba. So Baba wrote or cabled back and said, of course, Navjote, absolutely, and come to India at this time. So we went to India. I always get the date wrong. I think it was 1963. I was 7. And I think we were there for 2 or 3 months. I don't quite know how I got time off school, but and I needed it because I had to learn myriad prayers for the Navjote in a language I'd never spoken in my life that had to be said for this big deal ceremony. The photos from my Navjote, it's just like a wedding, this massive event, so it had to be done properly. So that was, we went to India for my Navjote, but of course we went to India to see Baba. So that's when my father sat me down and told me who Baba was. And so at the age of 7, he actually said the words. And, I don't remember too much about it, but I do recall he said, so Shireen, we live here and you go to a school where you go to assembly and say prayers, that's what they did in England then. And, you're praying to Jesus, and we live in a Christian country and Christians believe in Jesus. And I said, oh yes, I knew all that, I knew that. So he said, well, we believe in Baba, and Baba's God. And I said, oh, okay. And then for the first time he said, Baba's your uncle. I said, oh. And, I sort of took it in my stride and I said, oh, this is... And then looking at the photos, and it all starts to make sense a little bit to me, why we have all these photos of him. And I wish I could talk about my dad more, but I don't think there's time. So my father, some of you met him, I can't see anyone else here who might have done, but he was a remarkable man. And he knew what to say, and he knew when to be pithy and succinct, and he knew when to elaborate, but he kind of, whenever he said anything, you listened. So I understood, I heard what he said. So he said, so we're going to meet Baba, and then he started to tell me about all the things that I mustn't do. Because he's saying, he's God in human form, we're going to meet him. Now my parents, and whenever I tell this, I just say to anyone here, well look, if some of you took your children to India when they were little to meet the Mandali, I don't know if anyone here has done that, but where you might be slightly worried about whether your Western child is going to behave appropriately, and I think for my parents, and I was very well brought up, I will say, and I was, a fairly old-fashioned household. My parents were very loving, but I respected my elders, all of that. They didn't have to really worry too much, but I know there was anxiety. They must have thought, oh, Shireen's this little English girl, what's she going to be like? Is she going to be fussy about the food, which I was, etc., etc. And so my father was, because, I was excited. I remember being so excited. And he said, so, there are certain ways of behaviour. And he went through all that with me. So he told me that I mustn't throw myself on Baba, I mustn't hug him, I mustn't be too loud, that Baba was frail. He told me how to put my hands together and bow down to Baba, that we'd have garlands and that I must grace, very sort of carefully place the garland on Baba, and to be sort of sedate, and moderate in my behaviour. That's what he was trying to say. And I shouldn't speak too much. You can imagine all the things. And so I didn't listen to any of that. Right from the moment he told me, and again, cast your minds back, I was 7. And I also had like most children, nothing about me, but I had a pretty active imagination, so I believed in everything. I specifically, of course, Father Christmas, but I was a big believer in, Mary Poppins, and, but witches, I was very worried about witches, and magicians. I had wanted a magic wand for so long, and so my mind was, I'm going to meet God, and everything I've ever wanted to know about, I just thought, so anything my dad said, I was like, I was planning my trip on my own sort of terms, but I was also very mindful of doing the right thing. So anyway, big excitement, big palaver, we're going to India. And I'd never been on an aeroplane, and my mum was just frantically sewing me these very sort of 1960s unfortunate sort of frou-frou dresses, she really wanted me dolled up for Baba, and I was very dolled up. And so she was worried about that, and making me look pretty and wanting me to sort of have the right, to be who Baba would hope I might be, the niece who wasn't living there. Because, Baba had his niece Gulna, I don't know if you ever met her, the twins, Rustam and Saurabh's sister. But I was the little one. I was younger by a good 30 years, I think, than Gulna.
Yeah, she's a good bit older.
And then the twins are about 14 years older than I am. Yeah. So we went, my dad, my mum, Dara and me to India, and because it was, the first visit for a long time, big welcome. So Vilu, Saroj, countless other people came to Bombay Airport to greet us, and a fleet of cars. I think Baba had sent one of his cars, and I'd never experienced anything like that in my life. I was entering a totally different world. It was extraordinary. So all these people came, all these uncles and aunts, and it was fantastic, And then I seem to recall though that we didn't get in the cars, but we had to take a train, which was pretty traumatizing, an Indian train in those days. I guess we must have gone to Pune. I can't remember, maybe we'd divided up somehow. So, and again we got to Pune and then met Pareen and Jal. Jal is my uncle, Behram was my uncle, married to Pareen, if any of you. So Baba's brothers who were surviving at that time were Behram, Jal and Adi, my father. Behram was married to Pareen, and they are the twins' parents. And then Jal didn't marry, and then my dad had Dara and me. So it was just extraordinary in terms of, I suppose, culture shock and just the absolute beyond excitement of it. And the fact that I was missing school for so long, I was like, it was just a whole different world. And again, always that idea that we were different. I wasn't English, but I was raised in a very English way. And I think I almost felt like I'm really now going to what's real. I'm going to what I knew was us, was our family, something a little different. So we got to Ahmednagar, and my mum and I stayed with her parents, my grandparents, in their lovely big house, which some of you may have seen in Ahmednagar. And my dad stayed at Merazad with Baba, and then Dara went to stay with his aunt, who was like a mother to him, Vilu and Saroj. So we were in these different places. So then, we settled in, and the first day came, I guess it was after a day or two, that we all went to see Baba. And, I can never adequately describe, I've never ever done it, I've never been able to put it into words, what it felt like for me to finally be doing this, to go to meet Baba. I mean, I was bursting with excitement. So there was a lot of my father telling me to be quiet, don't do this, don't do that, she's too excitable, Franny, do something with her, that sort of thing. You can imagine, that any of us might feel that. So again, we went in a complete sort of, it was just a retinue of cars, there were so many of us, and because it was the first day, everybody was there, again, Velu and Saroj, and just people I don't even know who they were, but it was a big family visit. And we turned down the road to Merazad, which again, do most of you know Merazad? And there's that private sign, I think. And my heart was thumping, and I was nervous too. And the car was fragrant with garlands, so many garlands, that we were going to garland Baba and each other, and it was just this whole. And of course, when I was a child, it felt like the longest road I'd ever driven down. It's really not that long. And we arrived, and I'm trying to sort of picture it, but the Lady Mundley were the first to greet us. So I, for the first time, I'd met them as a baby, but I met my aunts, who were, from that moment on, going to be extremely important people in my life. I mean, even though I didn't live in India, I had a very strong attachment to them, and they were involved in our lives, in my life, always. So I met these amazing women, and how many of you have met them? All of them. Yeah, so incredible, loving, I'd never experienced anything like that, ever. And I grew up in a very loving household. My parents doted on me, but I'd never experienced that outpouring of just love and affection. It was so incredible. And as a child. So, all the hellos, and Baba was in Mundley Hall. And this could be just something I'm remembering, but I sort of, have this memory of maybe seeing his foot, because his chair was right by the door, I suppose, for the breeze. And this absolute, just anticipation, nerves, butterflies in my stomach, of meeting him. So finally it all kind of came together, and we queued up to go and bow down to Baba. And at that point my dad, I mean, no holds barred, he was just saying, just put the garland on, I said, okay, Dad. And you really want, and I was, because it all dolled up. And I had very, very long hair, that comes into a later story, but I had hair down to, my thighs, and because my mum thought Baba would like that, being raised in England, she thought he'd like the fact that she kept that sort of tradition. So we go in, and I follow my dad, and Dara might have gone in ahead, and it was a little solemn, and everyone was quietly going in, bowing down, and to Baba, and he did help people, I'm sure. So my dad gave me the final, bit of advice or warning, and I was clutching my garland. I remember it, just really clutching this garland, and the flowers were falling because I was so like. And I walked in, and I had my head down. I knew I had to do that, and I was trying to put my hands like this, and the garland was flipping. And I looked up at Baba, and he had the biggest smile on his face of anyone I'd ever seen, with his arms wide open, and I threw the garland, and flung myself at him, and sat on his lap and hugged him, and that was it for me. That was the beginning of, I didn't listen to anything my father said the entire trip. So, and my father was, maybe he said some apology, but you can imagine Baba was just leave her be. And so for the entire trip, I was so fortunate. And I keep saying there were other people there, but honestly, I think when you're 7 and Baba is giving you the most unbelievable attention, you don't really notice anyone else. I mean, I loved being with the Lady Mandali, and that would happen when Baba was resting, and I was told I shouldn't, pester Baba or anything. So that was the beginning, and he was the sweetest, most loving, avuncular, adorable and adoring person I'd ever met, and every minute that I was there, I wanted to be with him. So the days that we couldn't go to Marizad, I was very agitated, and I was just waiting. And actually, as the time approached for my Navjote, my parents very sensibly, the Navjote was at the end of the trip, so I had time to learn these Zoroastrian prayers, which were really tough. So there were days when the priest would come, and I had to learn these prayers, and I was frustrated because I wanted to be with Baba. I just forgot to mention something though. Before going to see Baba at Marizad, we went to the trust office and met Adi K. I met him for the first time, and I thought he was completely terrifying. He just looked so scary and intimidating, and I remember thinking, is this a harbinger of what it might be like to meet Baba? And then I looked at photos of Baba all over his room, and I was 7, I didn't put 2 and 2 together. So there were photos of Baba when he was young and photos of Baba when he was older. And I asked Adi K, what does Baba look like now? Really worried that he'd say he looked like the young version, because the young version was stern. And Adi K said, Shireen, he obviously looks like this. He sort of set me straight, but I was very relieved because I wanted Baba to look, where he looks, his face is a little rounder and his hair's in a plait and he's older, because he looked a little stern to me in those early photos. So I was very happy with that. So then our sort of habit, we just have this routine of, I think we went to Marizad, if not every day, then probably every other day, or whenever Baba, it was all the time. There were some times when we didn't go. So we'd all go along, and it just became my routine to go to Baba, to play with him. I don't think I knew how lucky I was. And also Marizad, there was no one there. It was family. This was a family home. There were the Mandali, of course, and then some of the Westerners. Rana was there. I'm not sure if Francis was there, but it was just this big extended family, and I got to know them. I got to know Baba. So after a while, and Baba was so sweet to me. I mean, he just spoiled me rotten. I was just completely in heaven. He really did. And, I think my dad at that point was just, this has nothing to do with me, I'm out of it. My mum was always a little anxious, what's Shireen going to do, what's she going to say? And then, so then my poor parents, so I had become I was fairly shy as a child, and I was timid, diffident, I wouldn't I wasn't bold, but I became emboldened in that atmosphere. And, I was with Baba such a lot, so he was so sweet. I mean, I'd sit on the floor next to his chair, and I remember I just loved it. He would have soup. He'd have a sort of vegetable broth at some point in the day, and he'd drink it from the bowl, and then he'd give me the bowl. And, I didn't even like soup, but I remember thinking that this is, I'm so lucky. I remember thinking that. So as time went on, and I'm not sure how early into the trip, and I don't remember. I asked Baba a series of questions, and if anyone were interested, they are written up somewhere. So I had formulated some questions with my friend at school, because once my father told me who Baba was, I went to school the next day and told my friend, my uncle's God. And again, that no big deal, nothing so unusual. So she and I came up with some questions. I said, I'm going to India to meet him. So she said, oh, you can ask him. So we had all these questions that I was going to ask on behalf of the two of us. And then I just don't remember, but I suppose when I was there, I asked a lot of other questions. And at that point, I think my poor father almost had an out-of-body experience, because he was not prepared for that and didn't think, he probably didn't think I should be asking Baba questions like that. But Baba was so wonderful. He completely, I'm assuming, I vaguely remember that I said, Baba, I have questions, and my dad was like, no. Said, let her do it. So in Mundley Hall, I asked a series of questions, and Baba's response and his way of being was just, it completely sort of came down to my childish level. He took my questions very seriously. He didn't, brush them aside. He answered them. He thought about them. And I was, apart from one or two, I was very, very satisfied with the answers. So the first, I always have to be reminded, even though so I think the first question my friend wanted me to ask, and it was just very basic, which is higher in the sky, the sun, the moon, or the clouds? That was the best we could come up with. So I asked that question, and Baba smiled, and he smiled, and he waited a bit, and he said, I am the highest of the high. So that was, that was very nice. And then I asked him if I could have a magic wand, and he said I could, and I never got it. He said I could. And I was very concerned about witches, as I mentioned. So I asked him if witches were real, fully expecting him to say, no, don't worry. And I was really familiar with Baba. I probably was I'm sure my dad was having to rein me in a bit for maybe a little cheeky or whatever, but I just felt so at my ease. So I just thought, I'll just rattle off all these questions. So I asked about witches, and Baba paused. And I thought, oh no, he's not going to tell me they're real. And he did. He said, yes. And I was really crestfallen. And I said, and he said, no, but witches are bad people. He said, that's who witches are. And I said, oh, and they don't wear hats and fly on brooms? He said, no. So that was all right. I understood that. I asked him about reincarnation a little bit. And I think that's when my dad was a little bit taken aback, because he hadn't ever spoken to me about that. And then I asked Baba if I would have the same parents next time, and Baba said no, and that made me sad. He didn't explain why, but he said no. I asked him why, I think I asked him why in certain photos it seems as though he has a halo around him, or an aura of light, and that I couldn't see that when I looked at him. And he answered that when I really understood, or I can't exactly remember how he put it. It's in a book. That when I was really ready, I would be able to see him for who he truly was. But he did tell me that I loved him very much, and I really was happy to hear that. And then I asked him, which for me was probably my big question, and it's funny, but so I was born in London, you know, I'd never laid eyes on a snake as far as I know, didn't really know much about them, until my mother started telling me snake stories in a big way, but she was really worried that when I got to India, you know, like I'd play in the garden in England, that I shouldn't play like that in India. So my mum told me a lot of stories about holes and not putting my hand down holes, and I developed an absolute terror of snakes and scorpions, but specifically snakes, which lasts to this day. So I was very worried about meeting snakes in India. And I asked Baba, I said, Baba, you know, why have you made the... In fact, I'm just going to read, if you'll indulge me, because this has been written up somewhere, and it's sort of a bit better put than my own. In England, Shireen had little occasion to hear of snakes and scorpions, but in India, when she was warned about looking out for them, she felt frightened and disgusted. So I asked Baba, why did God create snakes and scorpions, creepy crawly things like that? Baba smiled and pointed to Erich for an answer. Erich said, and just by the way, like everybody I believe who met Baba, I don't remember Erich at all. Baba was talking to me. I mean, I know Erich was there, you know, and everyone I know who's met Baba has said the same thing, that the conversation was between oneself and Baba. So Erich, Baba said, God has created such things. Okay, sorry. Before he answered, Baba looked at me and he said, so what happens when you see anything like that or think of anything like that? And I said, I become frightened, Baba. And he said, what do you think of when you're frightened, or who do you think of? And I said, I think of you. So I didn't remember this. So he told me, my recollection is he told me, so sometimes you need to be reminded to think of me. Not everybody thinks of me. So when you see something, and again he's talking to a 7-year-old, but you see something scary, you think of me, it's a reminder. So I guess these were Baba's words. God has created such things so that in our fear we may call out to him and remember him. Shireen was not satisfied and retorted, but God is all-powerful, and so he can make us remember him directly, instead of through nasty, horrible things like snakes and scorpions. Was there any mistake on God's part in creating them? Such innocent, but equally deep questions startled those adults present. I think that's putting it really mildly. Baba appeared pleased and happy and explained to her, good and bad, beautiful and ugly are all mine. They are me. It was not a mistake on the part of God when he created snakes and scorpions. It is all as it should be. But why did God have to create such creatures? She insisted. Baba explained, and I just can't help it when I read this. I just have this sort of mental image of my father, you know, just paralysed with. Baba explained, you, Shireen, are so pretty and sweet, and yet every day when you sit on the potty, you bring out what is dirty and smelly. Why do you do it? Because it is necessary, and it helps to keep you well and pretty. And so are all things in God's creation necessary. Both good and bad, beautiful and ugly are mine. And that satisfied me. I did feel that, you know, that he was giving me, I was sort of at that point, I think, hoping he'd just say, oh, I'll just get rid of them. I mean, I just felt so, you know, so in his embrace, I sort of picture that happening. So one thing that, and I'm sure you've heard this from so many people, but, you know, Baba loved to be entertained. So when we were going to India for that first time, we got the message from Mera and Mani that, there should be some entertainment, and especially from Shireen, you know, she's in England at a Western school. Well, I was, a talentless child. I'll tell you, I had nothing that I could... I used to draw and that sort of thing. So my poor parents were racking their brains trying to think of something I could do to entertain Baba. And the only thing we could come up with was, because I went to this Christian... Well, it wasn't a Christian per se, but it was a school where the Church of England was, honoured and practised. So we would sing hymns. So all I could think of was to sing a hymn to Baba. So I have a pretty visceral memory of standing in Mundley Hall, which seemed gigantic to me, without any musical accompaniment, singing All Things Bright and Beautiful. and being so aware that it was so painful. But, you know, at the end, Baba smiled and he was so loving and everyone clapped and, you know, I just thought, well, that's done. But then something came the next visit that was, that sort of gave me a little bit of a reprieve, as it were, or maybe it was an antidote to my poor performance, because I later on told Baba some jokes that he really liked. So as I said, you know, I would wanted to see Baba. We'd go there all the time. My father would disappear. Dara and my dad, I don't remember seeing them because they disappeared with the men mandali. And my mum and I were with Baba and the lady mandali. And one of the nicest parts of the day was having lunch in the dining room. If any of you been, how wonderful it is there. So we would have lunch. And Money, my Aunt Money, was very sweet. Mary used to sit on her right, and Money would sit on Baba's left. Mary would sit on Baba's right. Money would sit on Baba's left, and Money, I called her Money Fui, and Fui means father's sister. She gave me her seat, so I was very privileged to sit next to Baba. And but one thing that happened was, I didn't like Indian food. My mum had tried to make it in England and I had nothing to do with it. So my poor parents and my mum was, you've got to, you know, you must not refuse Indian food. It would be really, and I was really a fusspot. And I was actually very thin. Not that thin, but because my mum was from the East, she thought I was wasting away and I certainly was not. So in the dining room with Baba, my mum started telling Baba that I wasn't eating properly, I was too thin, and my food had been given, this was probably one of the first meals, and I'd been given a plate of rice and dal. And I looked at it and just, you know, you can remember when you were a child and you could not stand to eat the food that was in front of you. And it was building up in me, and I can't eat this, I can't eat this. And yet I knew enough that I was in Baba's home and I'd had this food served and I just didn't know what to do. So my mum was talking to Baba and I was sort of playing with my food. And Baba looked at me with a very sweet smile and he said, "Do you like the rice and dal, Shireen?" And I, of course, very politely said, "Oh yes, Baba, it's delicious." So I had a fork and Baba and the ladies ate with their hands. So I was, you know, then talked to somebody and I turned to Baba and was about to say something. And he took a huge amount of rice and dal in his hands and just shoved it into my mouth. Good, I'm glad you like it. So what could I do? You know, I swallowed it. And honestly, it's the truth. I've loved rice and dal ever since. I just loved it. It tasted so good. I love Indian food. It's my favourite food. You know, I crave it. So that was quickly dealt with. And then another really lovely thing that happened in the kitchen, in the dining room. And Money used to tell this story. This was just a sweet story. And for me, looking back, it was just so lovely because, as I said, you know, I was young. I mean, I just, Baba's God, he can do absolutely anything. You know, he can make the sun come out at night. I mean, I knew that. And I had this idea too of this is almost magical. So, something happened and it was lovely. So one day for lunch, we had a treat. An Australian Baba lover had sent a tin of fruit salad, which in 1963 was a pretty special thing to have fruit salad. I mean, I don't know that we had it at home in England. And you know, fruit salad often contains cherries. Mm-hmm. So it was this big tin of fruit salad. So Mara or Mani or maybe Naja, Baba's cook, Baba's cousin. Naja was Baba's cousin, if any of you met her or knew of her. All these wonderful ladies, I mean, just wonderful, wearing outfits like Donna. Donna's wearing Goethe's dress. So one of them said, "Baba, should we open the tin of fruit salad as a treat?" And Baba said yes. So he said to me, "Do you like fruit salad?" And I said, "Oh yes, yeah." So I was very excited, and I think there might have been ice cream, which is extraordinary to think about it. So when it was opened, it was poured into a bowl and then served. And Baba said, "Shireen, do you like cherries?" I said, "Oh yes, Baba." And so he said to whomever, you know, give Shireen all the cherries. So, you know, I was spoiled rotten. So I got the bowl with all the cherries, you know, I was very happy, eating away. Thank you, Baba. So he said, "Are you enjoying it?" I said, "Well, yes, very good, thank you, Barbara." And then he said, "Well, do you want more cherries?" And I, of course, said, "Yes, please." And he looked over to, I think it was Katie, and he said, "Can you give Shireen some more cherries?" And Katie said, "Oh, Barbara, no, I gave all of them to her." And he said, "No, just look in the bowl." So he looked, and there were a few more cherries. So she said, "Oh, I found some." He said, "Oh, good, give them to Shireen." So I got the cherries. I was very happy. He said, "Do you like them, Shireen?" I said, "Yeah, I love them. Delicious." And he said, "Do you want more?" And I said, "Oh, yes, please." And he looked at Katie and went, "I'm just completely sort of, this is my distant memory, but." And she said, "No, Barbara, they're all gone." He said, "No, just look in the bowl." Well, there were more cherries. And so I don't remember how many times this happened. Money told the story, and I think it happened a number of times. And they were just, well, this is obviously Barbara's doing something here. And finally, I even caught on. It took a while, but I even realised there's no way there can be that many cherries in one tin of fruit salad. So I was just so happy. I felt like he performed a little bit of magic for me, to be honest. It was how I saw it. So those were just such happy times, and that's how I got to know my aunts. And as I said, they continue to have such an important play such an important role in my life. I mean, my aunts arranged our wedding. We lived in England, but we felt incredibly close and connected. So Barbara used to, of course, rest, and during his rest hour, and it was usually in the afternoon, I was told categorically to not disturb him, and I did listen to that. I understood, to be quiet, and that was when I would spend a lot of time with the Lady Mundley. That was really fun. We'd play games. I used to ride Go-Her's bike. So one afternoon, and again, this is like a child's imagination, but one afternoon I was riding the bike, and Merazad seemed, again, vast to me, and it's not that big, but as a child it was huge. So I was riding all around, and then I suddenly discovered a secret path. Well, it wasn't, but it was, to me it was a secret path. And then I looked, and I thought, "Oh, this is a secret path to Barbara's room." And it was just a path to the back door to the room. But to me, and I looked in, and I'd been told absolutely not to go there, not to disturb Barbara, but I couldn't help it. So I got off the bike, went and peeked through a window. I sort of remember a little window, and seeing Barbara and seeing the back of his head, and not knowing what to do and thinking, is he asleep? And then suddenly he beckoned me in. So I went in thinking, I'm going to get into some serious trouble with my parents, but I'm going in to see Barbara. And again, my memory is that nobody else was there. Now, of course, I'm sure Erich was there. Had to be, because Barbara and I talked. We talked about school, about my toys, about my friends. He was so sweet. He listened to all of the stuff I was rabbiting on about, totally inconsequential things. He asked me a lot about school, what I liked to study, who my friends were. I told him I wanted to be a ballerina. Just typical stuff. I was, as any 7-year-old, and then we used to play games, and I think you know, but he would just really simple things, but little games like he'd play with his fingers, and then something we did. He had a lot of hankies. It was sort of pre-tissues almost, and so he and I would knot handkerchiefs. And if any of you have ever watched Monty Python and remember anybody seen that with Monty Python where they wear the knotted hankies? It's a kind of British working man seaside look where you have a hanky on your head in lieu of a hat to protect you from the sun. So Barbara would make these little hats with me out of the hankies, and then we'd swap and put them on each other's heads. And I can remember one time, Erich or somebody came in, and it almost felt like we'd been caught, playing hooky or something, because I wasn't supposed to be in there. Barbara was supposed to be resting. But that's what it was like for me. It was incredible, and I did continue to do this. I would go there and see him when he was resting, and he was just so much fun. And I remember one time he was in the wheelchair because he was quite frail, and on the outside Merazad on the, what would you call it, the platform, the veranda, and he and I were playing, and then my Aunt Manny called me to play with something, and I had just shown Barbara a new handbag that I'd got from the bazaar. And I didn't know what to do with my handbag. I was very torn because I loved my handbag and I was showing it to Barbara, but I wanted to go and play with my aunt. And so I asked Barbara if he would look after my handbag. And he did, and he held it just like, the Queen. It was just like this the entire time I was playing. And then I went back and he said, "I've kept your handbag safe." So he was so incredibly sweet. So for that trip, have I left anything out before I get to the Navjote? Sorry, I'm not quite as polished as I should be. Oh, there were a couple of things that happened. So as I said, I probably got a little bit big-headed even. I was being spoiled by Barbara, and I very much thought that I should be with him all the time. So two things happened that sort of, knocked me off my, disabused me of that a little bit. So the first was, the first was fantastic. It just reinforced that feeling. So I think I'd been just irritating, particularly irritating one day, and my dad thought I was being too much of a pest and was just being a bit of a trouble, asking too many questions of Barbara. And so Barbara would send his car to my mum and me, and we'd go to Barbara in his car, and then I think we would pick up Dara, but my dad was already at Merazad. My dad was with Barbara all the time. So one day, the car came, and my dad had sent a message, or perhaps he came in the car, and basically said, "You're not going to see Barbara today." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "No, you're being, you need to just have a quiet day, and you're pestering Barbara." I know, I was so upset. So of course I was carrying on, weeping and wailing. And he must have taken my mum and Dara, and they went, or the car just picked up my mum and Dara, and they went to Barbara. So I was at home with my grandparents, really heartbroken, feeling sorry that I wasn't seeing Barbara, but also I remember feeling bad that perhaps I'd been annoying and had perhaps overstepped. I had all these kind of little mixed feelings, feeling very sorry for myself, very sorry for myself. So then I don't know how much time passed, then Barbara's car drives back and I could see it from the window, and my father must have been in it. So of course I looked out and rushed downstairs, and my dad said, "Get in." So Barbara asked, Dara was there, my mum was there, I'm sure, and Barbara asked, "Where's Shireen?" And my dad said, "Barbara, I thought you needed a break from her." For Barbara to do that, you can imagine, I just was over the moon beside myself. I was just like, my dad is not my authority figure on this trip. And I went back and I was so happy. But the sort of opposite happened, and I know some of you know Phyllis Ott, and I wonder if I should, is this being recorded? It's not a bad story, it's a funny story. I think it's totally fine to say. So really we'd had Barbara to ourselves, that's all I'd known on that trip. That was for me the whole reason we were there. And one day we went to Merazad, and we would see Barbara in Mundley Hall or in his bedroom, and I loved seeing him in his bedroom especially because his bedroom was so lovely. It was pink, it was for a little girl, it was just so nice. I could sit on his bed, we could play, all of those things could happen in his bedroom. Mundley Hall was a little more formal. But it was a time to go to Mundley Hall, and Mundley Hall always sort of had, as it were, an open door policy. I think literally the door was always open. But on this particular day, whether the door were closed or not, I couldn't go in. And I remember being told, no, you can't go in now, Barbara's seeing some people. And I remember thinking, what people, who are these other people who exist? What's going on? Well, it was Lynn and Phyllis Ott. And Phyllis, who knows Phyllis? Some of you know Phyllis. She's an incredible person. So I think it's true, and I was a very well-behaved girl, I was. Manners were big, my parents were very strict. But after 2 months perhaps of being there, being really, really indulged, to be told that I couldn't see Baba because these two interlopers were there. So I think it's possible that I didn't give Phyllis a really nice big smile when I was there. So Phyllis, to this day, 50-something years on, always says, "Oh, Shireen, you didn't like us then, did you?" I said, "No, I probably didn't, I'm sorry." It was just a funny bit of a wake-up call, but no, Baba actually, there were other things that Baba was doing. And, you know, it just goes without saying, I think. It's nothing so surprising. So Baba made you feel as though you were the only person there. That was just it. And of course, Baba was doing so much else. He was interacting with so many other people. That's all I felt. And the only other people in the world I've ever met who, you know, conveyed the same feeling would be the Mundleys. So my Aunt Money and Mara. I mean, how they did that, but that was it. They would make, you know, us feel so cared for, and yet they were dealing with so many other people and so many other things. So that was how it was with Baba. So the time for the Navjote approach, and so what I haven't said is really when I got there, when we got to India, you know, I had to start learning these very difficult prayers in a foreign language. You know, it didn't mean anything to me. And I knew too that this was a formality. We were doing the Navjote to make my grandfather happy. And of course, before, you know, doing the Navjote, my parents asked Baba, "Can we do this for Shireen? Is this okay?" And he said, "Absolutely do it, you know, make Dinshaw happy." So I had to learn the Zoroastrian prayers, and then sort of right before I did the Navjote, Baba told me that I had to learn the Pavadigar prayer. And he told my mum. And she of course said, "Yes, Baba," but she was thinking, how on earth can Shireen learn Zoroastrian prayers and the Pavadigar prayer? This isn't possible for her to, you know, both very difficult for a child. But of course she said she would do this. So I would have my lessons with the Dustor, I think is the priest. And didn't really take in what he was telling me because my mind was on Baba. And when can I leave this and go to see Baba? And my mum had to work out when on earth she could impress the Pavadigar prayer on me. So she thought the only time that I'd sit still and listen is because I had such very long hair. She would comb it every morning, and it would took for, you know, an hour. It was just, it was full of knots and everything. So she thought, all right, the only time is this time, Shireen sitting still. So she taught me the Pavadigar prayer while my hair was being brushed. So on the morning of my Navjote ceremony, and it was a big hoopla, you know, because also my uncle Sorosh, my mother's uncle Sorosh, who was very important in our family, and my mother looked upon him more as a father more than her own father in a way. And he was a very important figure in Ahmednagar. I think he was the mayor of Ahmednagar. So because of his status, this was a big Navjote ceremony. So it was just huge, so many people. You know, I had to wear multiple dresses, and so that was a very grand occasion. So then, a few days before my Navjote, Baba told my parents that he wanted us to go to Marazad that morning where he would perform my real Navjote ceremony. And that was when he wanted me to say the prayer to him. So I had a sort of double, you know, I was nervous about the Navjote and the prayers and very nervous about saying the Pavadigar prayer and getting it right for Baba. But, you know, that's what we had to do. So that morning we went to Marazad, and it was just so lovely. I remember it very well. We went early. It was so quiet and simple, just Baba, the Mundley, the family. And I stood on a stool, and in the Navjote ceremony, with the Zoroastrians, you're given officially for the first time the Sadra, you know, we all know what a Sadra is, and the Kasti, which is a thread, it's a sacred thread that is it just men? I'm not sure, but I think every Zoroastrian wears a thread ceremony, exactly, it's called the thread ceremony. So this is these are two very important sort of ritual garments that you wear. And at the actual Navjote ceremony, you wear the Sadra for the first time and you wrap the Kasti around yourself, or the priest does, and that's it, you wear that. So Baba handed me, I just stood on the stool in front of him and he handed me the Sadra and Kasti. I think he put the Kasti around me, and then he said, so now say the Pavadiga prayer. And I did it. I said it and I got it right. So that was a big relief, you know, and it was very moving. I remember, you know, even at that age, feeling there was it was a solemn occasion. And then we went back to my grandparents and I got ready for this big, you know, very kind of celebratory, you know, very, very public event. And I didn't get any of my prayers right. So my poor parents, you know, I'm on this stage with the priest, I'm having to do all these things, and I could not remember one prayer, and it was just sort of gobbledygook. And I remember one of my aunts, not a monthly member, but one of my aunts leaning down and saying, you know, you've got everything wrong, Shireen. But I remember thinking, well, I said the Pavadiga prayer, and that's what my parents said. They said, don't worry that you did it. Oh my gosh, oh, I'm so sorry, I haven't even got to part 2. We'll do that with your talk.
Yeah,
sure.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
5 minutes, 10 minutes?
10.
Well, I'll start with the second visit, if that's okay, and then I'll just finish it when we're talking.
But was it on the first or second visit when you were asked what's more important, to obey or?
Second.
Second.
Visit, yeah. Because the second visit was, for me, I think the first visit was just a very sweet, blissful visit, and the second visit too, it was so wonderful to be with Baba, but I was 11, and there's a big difference between 7 and 11, and I was thinking much more sort of consciously about who Baba was, and I had more questions, and I was sort of much more aware, self-aware, I don't know, you know, a little self-conscious, and that was a very interesting visit for me. Excuse me, and it really sticks in my mind, so I'm sorry I've taken so long with this. So the Navjote happened, and then we went back to England. And of course it was, I couldn't believe that we were leaving. I didn't understand why we were going back. I really thought our life was there with Baba. I just didn't grasp any sense in going back to this life in England. So Baba said, don't worry, you know, you'll see me again. And I did, you know, we did go one more time. Excuse me. So during the gap, so many things transpired, and I think I'll just wait and tell those later. But what did happen was just endless correspondence between us and Baba. And again, he's not just us, I mean, he was writing to everyone. But somehow, how on earth it happened that there was time. But so lots of cables from Baba. I would write these endless letters to him, and I'd write the letter, and I have notoriously terrible handwriting. It's even worse now. It wasn't great then, but I remember I would write these letters and then put kisses all around them to Baba. And then at some point getting a letter from Mera saying, Shireen, Baba loves your letters, but please don't put so many kisses. No one can read what you're saying or what you're writing. And so we would have this correspondence. And then, you know, after 4 years, and again, I'll tell you about what happened in the interim, because some very interesting things did happen. But one thing that was wonderful is I had wanted a dog, and so I was pleading with my parents for a dog, and I said, you know, ask Baba, say that we can have a dog. And anyway, we did get a dog, and you know, like again, not just us, Baba was like this with everyone's pets, but our dog was so lucky. Baba mentioned his name in every cable, everything, and his name was Chan, and Chan came from Buckingham Palace, and it was just such a great story. And Baba loved the fact that he was a so-called royal dog.
Was it a corgi?
Pardon?
Was it a corgi?
No, a completely demented Pekingese. Not what you'd think of, not a frou-frou little, no, a total sort of wild, super macho, completely incontinent dog who was so special and so wonderful, and you know, again, Baba loved, you know, he loved people's animals and always mentioned them, but he always loved Chan. So just tell me when I have to stop. So with the passage of time, do I need to stop now? Should I just wait?
No, a few more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as the years passed, you know, I of course couldn't wait to see Baba again, and the great thing happened, which was that my brother Dara married Amrit, and I think some of you know them. So this wedding was arranged by Baba. It's, incredible, really. What a story. So I was just so excited, once I heard about this, that we were going to go and see Baba again. But we did know, and I did know, that Baba was frail and that he had been unwell. But one thing that did occur, and I can talk about it more later, in England you go to what's called a junior preparatory school, and then at the age of 11 you move on to a senior school. And I actually went to 2 very good junior schools, but then it was time for me to sit the exams to go to the senior school. And my parents were, thinking about that and what to do and where shall we send her. And the message came, of course they asked Baba, they said, well, what should we do? Should Shireen sit exams? Should we try and send her to a private school? My parents didn't have money. In England we call private public school. And Baba said, wrote back, or sent a message and said, yes, and I want Shireen to go to St Paul's Girls' School. And St Paul's Girls' School is a really famous school in England. It's an incredibly elite school, and it's still, I think, every year is like the top. We call it the league table. It's the top of exams. It's incredibly academic, hard to get into. And my poor mum, heard that, and she thought, oh my God, there's no way Shireen is going to get into this school. But Baba said it. So, and he said, have Shireen apply to all these other schools too, that were also very good schools. But, and I can tell it in more detail, the reason Baba wanted me to go to St Paul's Girls' School is that that's where Kitty Davey went.
No.
Oh.
She went in the first year. So St Paul's School is about 600 years old, and it was only boys. And St Paul's Girls' School, I think, started in the early 1900s, and that's when Kitty was in the first year. And it really, there was a whole story and minor mini miracle as to how I got in.
Yeah.
And I often, thought, how did this happen and why? Why did Baba? And then it became really clear. He loved Kitty so much, and it made Kitty so happy that I went there. And just in case you don't know, so Kitty really, she came to Baba because Baba wanted her to come to him, but her interest, and you all know who Kitty Davey was, yes?
Yeah.
Her interest in Eastern spirituality was sort of inspired by her association with the composer Gustav Holst, who wrote, amongst others, The Planets. He was an amazing composer, and he actually was the music director at St Paul's Girls' School when Kitty was a student, and he died before I went there. So there's this kind of connection, and then our house, Mermansel in London, was down the road from Gustav Holst's home. There's like in England, they have these blue plaques for famous people, so everything just feels so connected. So Kitty was a student at St Paul's. She took private music lessons from him. He introduced her to some kind of Eastern mysticism, which then kind of took her to Baba. So there's this tight connection, and Baba wanted me to go to that school, and it was kind of amazing that I got in, and I did go there. And then what was even more amazing after that was that I was able to stay on, and I don't know, there just isn't, I won't tell the story now then, shall I wait?
Is it about 5 minutes worth?
Go for it.
Yeah, go for this one more story.
This one too. So, I was reasonably intelligent and all of that, but I wasn't very academic. That changed, but I wasn't at that age. So, my mum told my school teacher we'd like Shireen to go to St Paul's Girls' School, and I actually was going to St Paul's Preparatory School, but there was no real link. And they said the same thing. They said, look, she's bright enough, but she's not going to get in. It's very, very hard to get into the school. So my mum was, I don't know, what am I going to do? So my father said, Franny, don't worry so much. Baba said he'd like this, but it doesn't have to happen, but we must try. And there are these other schools. So a couple of things happened. One was that I had to really, really knuckle down and suddenly become interested in academics, which I did do. But I can't overstate how hard it was to get into this school. Even now, people put their children's names down when they're in utero. It's that kind of a place. So back then, it was it was very difficult. So all this is going on. My mum, you know, is definitely a worrier, and in her mind, Barbara asked this, and this had to happen, and you know, so the exams are approaching, and then she wanted to rely on my father, obviously, for some support and then my father just disappears to India. So Barbara was in seclusion, but he called my dad to India to just be with him and to also talk to him about Dara and Amrit's wedding, which happened that December. So my school exams were maybe in May, June, Barbara was in seclusion, and then the wedding was in December. So my dad, of course, dropped everything and left. And my mum, you know, who fully understood that my dad would go to Barbara, she said, but what about me and this one? Because I wasn't exactly focused. And he said, oh, don't worry about it, don't worry about it. So my poor mother, I think in the middle of it, she might have broken her wrist. So my father, as I said, he was sort of a man of a few words at times, and at other times he had a lot to say. So he was fairly, you know, blithe about the whole thing. And when he left, he said, Shireen, don't worry, you know, I'll give Barbara your love, and I'll ask him to help you get into the school. He wants you to go there. I'll ask Barbara. And of course, I was sending millions of letters and who knows what to Barbara. And my dad said, almost at the last minute, very casually, he said, oh, there's one thing. He said that, so the headmistress of the school, she wasn't even a headmistress, she was a high mistress, and we had to curtsy to her. She was a dame. He said the high mistress of this school lived in India. She was with Mountbatten during the transfer of rule from England to India. So she said she's going to know of the Indian background, and she'll probably ask you who the Prime Minister of India is. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, you know, do you know who it is? And I said, you know, and he said, it's Indira Gandhi. And that was all he said. He said, just remember Indira Gandhi. I said, okay, Daddy, you know. And he went off to Barbara, and I was at home and not taking this terribly seriously, but somewhat, and my mum was beside herself with anxiety. So I went to sit the exam for all of the schools, but the first one was St Paul's Girls' School. And I was very ill, but didn't know it. So I go into the exam, my mum's sitting, and the building, the school is just incredible. It's like this beautiful old English building, you know, oak panelling and marble floors. I mean, just lovely, very imposing. So I go off and sit my exam, and then halfway through, I left. And I came out, and there's my mother looking at me, just, what's the matter? And I said, I feel very ill, and I had a raging temperature, and it turned out I had German measles, which she called rubella. So I was very sick, and I said, you know, I can't do the exam, I just can't do it. And she said, all right, don't worry, Barbara, this is all Barbara's doing, he understands, we tried, you tried. Don't worry about it. I mean, she was very crestfallen, you know, I could tell. So we went home, and then I can't remember exactly, but regardless of the fact that I'd walked out of an exam, and then she told my teacher, and my teacher said, forget it, Mrs. Irani, there's no way that Shireen will get in, you know, it's finished, she left the exam, it's not possible, so just give up on that. So Mum said, all right. So I still, though, did have the interview with Mrs. Munro, the High Mistress. So we thought, well, why not? We'll just do that, even though, you know, I knew I'd failed any hope of being accepted to St Paul's. So I went in for that, and, you know, this really imposing office. She was sitting behind this massive desk, and I was terrified, and this huge door that had to come pushed again. And I was fairly, what's the point? Why am I even here? And I was nervous, so we did the interview, and I don't think it went very well at all, and she asked me to read something, and she asked me to define a word, and I remember getting that wrong and thinking, oh, well, you know, I've tried. So then she said, all right, you know, bye. And I got up to leave, and I was pulling this massive door to leave, and curtsied, and she said, Shireen, your family are from India, is that right? And I said, oh, yes, you know, I sort of explained a bit. She said, well, do you know who the Prime Minister of India is? And I thought, that's something I actually know. I said, yes, Indira Gandhi. And she sort of smiled. Well, you know this, I got in. And it was a miracle, because I left the exam,
I wasn't the brightest bulb at that time, but something happened, and of course what happened was that Baba, for his own reasons, wanted me to go. And so then when the results came in, my mum was, poor thing, got all these hostile phone calls from the other parents. Shireen get it. So that's, and there's more, but I'll tell that next time.
Jay Bonner.